Well, good morning, friends. Today we step into the third week of our series on the Bible in 6 words. 2 weeks ago, we began this series with the first word, creation, a story that is captured in the first 2 chapters of the book of Genesis. And then last week, Catherine shared with us the story of the fall, our second word, a story that is conveyed through the chapters 3 through 11 in Genesis. Today we come to our third word, which is Israel. And in reality, the rest of the Hebrew Scriptures or the Old Testament is all about this particular word. And so, given this assignment for today, I had to ask myself the question, how in the world do you tell that story in 15 to 20 minutes? And how do you possibly choose which Scripture to use? Well, we're going to get to one in just a moment that I think captures the essence or the core of the story of Israel that we find there throughout the pages of the Old Testament. But before we do, I want to take just a moment to point us to the pivot that happens from Genesis 11, the end of the fall story, to Genesis 12, which is the beginning of the story of Israel. Now, maybe you remember from last week that in Genesis 11, we hear the story of Babel. That place where people gather and they decide that they are going to do something to make themselves great. And so they say, come, let us build a tower and make a name for ourselves. And then God thwarts those plans. And then in the very next chapter, Genesis 12, we hear the story of God going and calling out a man by the name of Abram. Of course, we come to know him later in the story as Abraham. But he is Abram at that point, and Abram is minding his own business, living in his own land. But whatever plans or ideas he had for a self-made, self-driven life are changed radically when God comes and calls him out and to go to a place that will become his people's home. And in that moment, God says, I will make your name great, Abram. This is the beginning of Israel's story. And in their remembrance of the story, as we will see in our scripture today, one of the things they always point back to is Abraham as the beginning of their ancestry. Now, this is a story that spans nearly 2,000 years from that call of Abram to the birth of Jesus. And next week, we will enter the next movement of the story with the fourth word, which is Jesus. This is a story about relationship. Specifically, it is about God's covenant relationship with a people called Israel. The nature of that relationship is crystallized when they are in the wilderness. Remember that they had been enslaved in the land of Egypt, and when they are wandering from Egypt to the promised land, it is there that the covenantal relationship takes shape. And so it is here where we will turn today. Specifically, I want to take us to the book of Deuteronomy, the last of the 5 books of the Torah. So this is a book that reflects near the end of that journey through the wilderness and some of Moses' final days and years. And in that book, we hear this part of the story. So let me invite you to listen along and perhaps look along as I read for you from Deuteronomy 6. Israel, listen. Our God is the Lord, only the Lord. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your being, and all your strength. These words that I am commanding you today must always be on your minds. Recite them to your children. Talk about them when you are sitting around your house and when you are out and about, when you are lying down and when you are getting up. Tie them on your hand as a sign. They should be on your forehead as a symbol. Write them on your house's door frames and on your city's gates. Now, once the Lord your God has brought you into the land that he swore to your ancestors, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give to you, a land that will be full of large and wonderful towns that you didn't build, houses stocked with all kinds of goods that you didn't stock, cisterns that you didn't make, vineyards and olive trees that you didn't plant. and you eat and get stuffed, watch yourself. Don't forget the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. This is the word of God for the people of God, and as God's people we say, thanks be to God. Today I want to take us back through that reading and look at some of the key moments that are there throughout that passage of Scripture. It begins with a command, Israel, listen. And the word in Hebrew that is translated for us as listen is the word Shema. Because of that, this whole section, particularly the first two verses of our passage today, are referred to as the Shema, that command that is given to the people. And it's important that we understand that that word Shema not only means listen, but it carries with it the idea that to really listen is to also obey. In fact, there is no other word in Hebrew to translate into obey because this is the word. If one truly listens, then one then acts on that listening and obeys. And so it would be appropriate for us to say, Israel, listen and obey. Our God is the Lord, only the Lord. And then in that next verse, we hear the kind of relationship into which the people of Israel are called and invited. It is a relationship grounded in love, and we remember that begins with God's initiative. Remember perhaps from a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about the creation story that the people of Israel began to tell while they were in exile, that it was based on an understanding that God desired to have a relationship with them grounded in love, not one which caused them to be fearful of violence from God. And so what we hear in the Shema is the call to, just as the people have received love, to respond with love back. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your being, and all your strength. This is a love that requires the putting forth of one's whole being. All that they have, all that they are, is meant to be invested in this covenantal relationship that they will have with God. Now, perhaps you remember that when we get to the New Testament and we get to the Gospels where Jesus is asked one time about the greatest commandment, and remember that in Torah, there are lots of commandments that the people are expected to abide by, the people of Israel. When Jesus is asked about the most important one, he points here. He says, the greatest commandment is this: love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, and all your strength. And then he ties that to another idea that is embedded here in this passage today and also is found throughout the pages of Torah and the commands that the people are expected to keep. Love your neighbor as yourself. That is a commandment that mirrors or is like the command to love God. One of the things that it is important for us to note is that we cannot understand Jesus and who Jesus comes to be in the world apart from the story of Israel. Jesus' own life emerges from the story of Israel and from the people of Israel, and he fulfills the obedience that they were intended to. As we continue through the passage today, we see that there is a calling to be aware of the relationship with God, always present with them. Wherever they go, the people are expected to have that idea, that commitment to covenant close at hand. And they're supposed to talk about it, to recite it to their children so that the covenantal relationship will be passed down from generation to generation. To talk about it both when they are at home and when they go out. To talk about it in public and to think on it when they are lying down at night and when they are getting up in the morning. The idea of covenant is one that is meant to be carried with them 24/7. And not only in their thoughts and in their words, but that there are to be physical signs that help them remember that covenant. And so phylacteries became a way for men, most commonly, of the Jewish faith and tradition, to literally tie, as the scripture says today, tie them on your hand and bind them to your forehead as a symbol. And so you see in this photo here an example of a man who has leather straps around his arm which are connected to a little box called a phylactery in which those words are held. And the same thing around his forehead, that strap that then has a box connected to it in which those words are kept. And they were to have a sign of this at the front of their homes as well, which is also identified in the scripture for us today. This witness to their faith that is on their doorpost is called a mezuzah. And again, here we see that inside that cylinder are words, the words that come from the Shema, so that they will always remember them wherever they are as they go about their day. That word remember, that is a key word to the relationship that Israel is meant to have with God as well. We see that in the last few verses of this passage today, that they are to remember that it is the Lord their God who brought them out of Egypt and brought them into a land that was promised to their ancestors. And here is where we hear reference to Abraham. And not only Abraham, but also to his son Isaac, and to Isaac's son Jacob. And perhaps you remember that Jacob is the one who wrestles with the messenger from God, and to whom the name Israel is given as a replacement for his name Jacob. Here is where that word Israel begins to be used in reference to the people. They are to remember who and where they came from. They are to remember God's graciousness in bringing them into a land and blessing them with land and with goods and with vineyards and with trees that they did not plant, and yet they will have the opportunity to benefit from. And then there is this word of caution to them. As you enter into that land full of blessing and abundance, watch yourself. Remember the life that you had before. Remember the way in which you were treated when you were in the land of Egypt and were in slavery, so that you will not turn around and treat others in that same way. So here we have it. In a nutshell, in this passage, we have the core: a loving relationship with God, a commitment to carry that idea of covenant with Him at all times, and a commitment to remember who it is that has carried them along the journey, and to therefore act in response to God's graciousness. Now, the rest of the story that we read across the pages of the Old Testament is really the unfolding drama of Israel trying to live into this relationship. We see them enter into the promised land, and we see them journey through a period of what we call the judges, leaders who were intended to guide the people through that period of time. We see the establishment of the kingdom of Israel, which we read about most often in the books of Kings and Chronicles. We see the building of the temple in Jerusalem as a physical sign of the covenant and of God's presence with them. We see them live through a time of exile and occupation by other empires. We see them return to the promised land. And all along the way, at various points through this journey, we hear from the prophets, those who were called to keep Israel accountable, those who were called to lead Israel back into that covenant relationship when they strayed away. Because the truth is, it's a messy story. The story of Israel is a messy one because there are so many places along the way where they mess up. And perhaps it is in that messiness where we today can ironically find some hope. So what can we learn about our own relationship from this story of Israel? Our relationship as the church, and also our relationships as individual followers of Christ. Well, a starting point for us is to remember that the relationship begins with God's love and God's commitment to take the initiative and to reach out to be in relationship with us. And we remember that this is an unwavering love. We do that in our liturgy of worship sometimes when we say these words, even when our love failed, your love, God, remains steadfast. We can then remember that our response to that kind of love that never lets go is to offer love ourselves. It is the other side of the relationship, and that the word all matters. Our love for God is meant to summon up everything from within us. And that means there is no room for compartmentalizing our life into different boxes that we keep nice and tidy and separate. We cannot have a box of faith here and a box of politics there and a box of finances here and a box of how we like to be entertained over here. Everything is part of one whole. And that whole is meant to bring honor and glory to God. It is meant to reflect our desire to love God back as God has loved us. And that means that it is important, my friends, that we be seeking to bind God's word to ourselves daily. Maybe not with physical signs, although that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing for us, but to think on and to reflect and to soak in the words that God has for us, to keep them close so that they might lead and guide every aspect of our lives. We remember that this also is meant to guide not only our understanding of who God is and how we respond to God, but it also is meant to guide our interactions with others. That our love of neighbor, even stranger, even enemy, reveals our love of God to the world. And so we hear these verses in the first letter to John in the New Testament. Dear friends, let us love each other, because love is from God, and everyone who loves is born from God and knows God. The person who does not love does not know God, because God is love. We also can learn from Israel's covenant relationship with God that we are meant to pass the relationship on, to recite to our children, to share the faith with others, to talk about it both at home and when we are out and about. When's the last time you had a conversation with someone outside of church about faith? And if it takes you a while to think about that, maybe that is a starting point for you to begin to reflect on what it might mean to let this idea of covenant with God soak into every aspect of your life. We also can learn from the story of Israel that our relationship with God does not move in a linear direction. Theologian Walter Brueggemann identifies a pattern that he sees in the story of Israel that we notice quite clearly in the Psalms, but also as we read through the story of generations of the people of Israel. That pattern is one that moves from orientation to disorientation to reorientation. And we see that pattern in our own experience, don't we? Our stories, like the people of Israel's story, are often messy. We find ourselves strengthened and in a great place in our relationship with God, and we are well oriented, only to have something come along that disorients us. And as I'm sitting here talking with you today, I'm thinking about 2020 and what a year of disorientation it has been. It has been a time to cry out to God, as you see illustrated in this picture. It has been a time where people have experienced anger and fear and greed and pride and violence and disappointment. It has been disorienting. And we can take comfort in knowing that our experience of these things is not unique. All we have to do is open up our Bible and find plenty of stories that at points along the way move from orientation to disorientation. But the good news is that God does not leave us there. God never left Israel there, and God does not leave us there. God is always wooing us toward a time of reorientation. I wonder if 2021 might be that kind of time for you and for me. An opportunity for us to step back into that reoriented way, to give thanks that God has seen us in our weakness, in our frailty, in our hurt, in our pain. And God is inviting us to be restored in our relationship not only to God, but in our relationships to others. So as we close today, I want to point to a verse that comes from near the end of the book of Deuteronomy. It is some of Moses' final words to the people before he dies. Moses doesn't get to make the journey across the river into the promised land, but he wants to leave them with some encouragement. And so he says this to them: I have set life and death, blessing and curse before you. Now choose life so that you and your descendants will live, by loving the Lord your God, by obeying God's voice, and by clinging to God. May it be so, my friends. Amen.